The words slipped out before I could stop them, hanging in the crisp October air like my breath on that chilly afternoon. There I was, standing in my doorway at 55 years old, asking a grocery delivery driver who couldn't have been older than my college students to carry more than just my weekly shopping. The look in his eyes told me he understood exactly what I meant. And in that moment, everything I thought I knew about starting over changed forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows of my colonial home on Maple Ridge Drive, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that David and I had picked out together 15 years ago. Back when we still made decisions together. Back when we still existed. I stood at the granite countertop, nursing my second cup of coffee and staring at the grocery list I'd been writing and rewriting for the past hour. It shouldn't be this complicated. Milk, bread, the organic spinach I'd grown to love during my attempts at healthy eating post-divorce. But somehow, even grocery shopping had become a minefield of memories and decisions I wasn't ready to make. My name is Catherine Mills, though everyone except my mother has called me Cat since high school. 55 years old as of last month, recently divorced as of 6 months ago, and currently experiencing what my therapist Dr. Martinez calls an identity reconstruction phase. I prefer to think of it as figuring out who the hell I am when I'm not half of something else. The house feels enormous now, all 3,200 square feet of it echoing with the absence of another person's routine. No morning news blaring from the den. No coffee maker programmed to start at exactly 6:15. No sounds of someone else moving through the spaces we once shared. I've been a high school mathematics teacher at Roosevelt High for the past 28 years, watching teenagers discover that algebra isn't actually designed to torture them, helping nervous seniors navigate calculus, spending my days in a world of formulas and solutions where every problem has an answer if you just apply the right method. Mathematics never lies to you. Numbers don't promise to love you forever, and then decide they're better suited for someone 20 years younger, with smaller student loan debt and no stretch marks from pregnancies that never quite happened. The divorce settlement gave me the house and a decent chunk of David's retirement savings, which his lawyer argued was fair, considering I'd supported us through his medical school by working double shifts at the campus tutoring center. Funny how money becomes a consolation prize for 32 years of believing someone when they say you're their person. The judge declared our marriage irretrievably broken, which seemed like legal terminology for what I'd been feeling for the past 5 years, but hadn't been brave enough to name. 3 weeks ago, my younger sister Emma suggested I try grocery delivery instead of forcing myself through the weekly ordeal of shopping alone. She'd found me crying in the cereal aisle at Whole Foods the previous Saturday, overwhelmed by the simple act of choosing breakfast food for one person instead of two. Emma, ever practical with her psychology degree and her perfectly organized life in Seattle, had gently suggested that maybe I didn't need to torture myself with every previously shared routine. Cat, there's no award for suffering through the transition, she'd said, rubbing my back, while other shoppers pretended not to notice the middle-aged woman having a breakdown next to the organic granola. Let someone else deal with the grocery store until you're ready. Focus your energy on the stuff that actually matters. So here I was, creating my third Fresh Mart delivery order, trying to remember if I actually needed yogurt, or if I was just ordering it because David used to eat Greek yogurt every morning with his vitamin regimen. The app promised delivery between 2 and 4 p.m., which gave me plenty of time to finish grading the stack of geometry tests sitting on my dining room table. Fall semester was in full swing, and my advanced placement students were struggling with proofs, trying to understand how to build logical arguments step by step. I'd always loved teaching proofs because they required students to think clearly, to build their reasoning carefully, to show their work. Life, unfortunately, didn't offer the same clear progression from hypothesis to conclusion. The doorbell chimed at exactly 2:30, the sound echoing through the house with an urgency that made my heart skip slightly. I'd been expecting it, had even been listening for the delivery truck, but the actual moment of human interaction still caught me off guard. These days, I could go entire weekends without speaking to another adult face-to-face, save for brief conversations with Maria, my neighbor who occasionally borrowed cups of sugar and always returned them with homemade cookies that I suspected were her way of checking on my emotional welfare. I opened the front door to find a young man standing on my covered porch, holding 2 paper bags and wearing the distinctive green polo shirt that marked him as a Fresh Mart employee. He was probably in his mid-20s, with sandy brown hair. That looked like he'd been running his hands through it, and warm hazel eyes that immediately made contact with mine instead of focusing on his phone or looking over my shoulder into the house. That simple act of direct eye contact felt remarkable after months of feeling invisible in public spaces. "Ms. Mills?" His voice was pleasant, slightly deeper than I'd expected, with the kind of genuine politeness that suggested good upbringing, rather than customer service training. "I have your Saturday delivery from Fresh Mart." "Yes, that's me. Thank you so much." I stepped aside and gestured toward the kitchen. "You can just set those on the counter if you don't mind. I know you probably have other deliveries waiting." "No rush at all," he said, carefully wiping his feet on the welcome mat without being asked. The small gesture struck me as unusually considerate for someone who probably made dozens of deliveries every weekend. "I'm James, by the way. I'll probably be handling most of your Saturday orders since I live pretty close to this neighborhood." James. Not Jimmy or Jim, but James. Something about the formality of his full name paired with his obviously casual job struck me as intriguingly incongruous. He moved through my kitchen with an easy confidence, setting the bags down gently, and beginning to unpack them without making it feel like an invasion of my space. His hands were surprisingly elegant for someone in a physical job, with long fingers that handled my groceries like they mattered. "Can I offer you something to drink?" The words came out before I'd really thought about them, an automatic response, from decades of hostessing dinner parties and faculty meetings. "I just made iced tea, and you look like you've been working hard in this heat." October in Portland could be unpredictable, swinging between crisp fall mornings and surprisingly warm afternoons that felt like summer's last desperate attempt to linger. Today had turned out to be one of those deceptively warm days that made you question your seasonal wardrobe choices. "That's really kind of you," James said, pausing in his unpacking to look at me directly again. "If you're sure it's not too much trouble, some iced tea sounds perfect." I busied myself getting glasses and ice, hyper-aware of another person moving around my kitchen for the first time in months. The space felt different with someone else in it, less cavernous and echoing, more like an actual room where people might gather and talk. James continued unpacking my groceries with a methodical care that suggested he took pride in doing his job well, organizing items by category rather than just emptying bags onto the counter. "You're very organized," I observed, handing him a tall glass of sweet tea with lemon. "Most delivery people just dump everything and run." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "My mom always said if you're going to do something, do it right the first time," he replied, accepting the glass with a smile that reached his eyes. "Plus, I figure you're trusting me with your food, which is pretty personal when you think about it. Someone's groceries tell you a lot about their life." The comment was unexpectedly thoughtful, and I found myself looking at my own grocery choices through his eyes. Organic vegetables for one, a small container of expensive ice cream, tea bags and honey instead of coffee creamer and sugar. Single-serving, portions of things that used to come in family sizes. The mathematics of loneliness calculated in shopping lists and portion control. "What does mine tell you?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. When had I started fishing for insights from grocery delivery drivers? But something about James's genuine manner made the question feel natural rather than desperate. He considered this seriously, taking a sip of tea while scanning the items he'd unpacked. "You're health conscious, but not obsessive about it. You like to cook real food, but you're cooking for one person now, which is a change. You read a lot." He gestured toward the stack of books visible on my kitchen table next to the geometry tests. "And you're probably a teacher, based on all those papers with red ink marks. Very observant." I felt genuinely impressed by his deductive skills. "Mathematics teacher at Roosevelt High, 28 years this fall." "I knew it," James said with obvious satisfaction. "You have that teacher energy, patient but no nonsense. I bet your students respect you." The compliment warmed me more than it should have. When had someone last noticed something positive about my professional demeanor? David had stopped asking about my work years ago, treating my job as background noise to his medical practice. But James seemed genuinely interested in my answer. "They're good kids, mostly. Teenagers are just adults who haven't figured out how to manage their emotions yet." Give them clear expectations and consistent consequences, and they usually rise to meet them. I realized I was talking more freely than I had with anyone in weeks. What about you? Is delivery driving your long-term plan? Or are you working towards something else? The question seemed to touch something deeper, and James's expression grew more thoughtful. I graduated from Portland State last spring with a degree in education, actually. Elementary focus. But the job market is pretty tough right now, and delivery work pays decent money while I figure out my next move. Plus, I get to meet interesting people. Education, of course. That explained his patience and observational skills, his natural way of making conversation without being intrusive. I could easily imagine him in a classroom, probably with the younger kids who would be drawn to his calm energy and genuine interest in their thoughts. Elementary education is a calling, I said sincerely. Those early years are so crucial for building confidence with learning. Have you done any substitute teaching while you're job hunting? Some. The districts around here are pretty saturated with candidates right now, but I keep applying and hoping something opens up. He finished his tea and set the glass down carefully. I should probably let you get back to your Saturday. Those tests won't grade themselves. I glanced at the stack of geometry proofs waiting on my dining room table, then back at James, who was preparing to leave. The prospect of returning to my empty house felt suddenly less appealing than it had an hour ago. When had I started dreading solitude? For the first few months after David moved out, I'd relished the quiet, the ability to control the television remote and eat dinner at whatever time suited me. But lately, the silence had begun to feel oppressive rather than peaceful. "Thank you for taking the time to chat," I said, meaning it more than casual politeness usually required. It's been nice to have a real conversation with another adult. Saturday afternoons can get pretty quiet around here. Something in my tone must have conveyed more than I intended, because James paused in collecting his empty bags and looked at me with what seemed like genuine concern. Not pity, which I'd grown to hate from well-meaning friends and colleagues, but simple human recognition of another person's experience. "I know what you mean about quiet Saturdays," he said gently. "I live alone too. And weekends can feel pretty long sometimes, especially when you're used to sharing them with someone else." The observation was so precisely accurate that I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of tension I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Here was someone who understood without needing the whole story, who could acknowledge loneliness without making it feel like a personal failing. "Exactly," I said simply, and the single word carried more weight than most of my conversations had in months. James smiled, shouldering his delivery bags with practiced ease. "Well, I'll probably see you next Saturday then. Same time work for you?" "Same time sounds perfect." After he left, I found myself standing in my kitchen longer than necessary, replaying our conversation and wondering why a 20-minute interaction with a grocery delivery driver had left me feeling more energized than I had in weeks. There was something about James's presence that had made my house feel less like a museum of my former life, and more like a space where actual living might resume. His easy conversation and genuine interest had reminded me that I could still connect with people, still be interesting to someone who didn't know my history, or feel obligated to check on my emotional welfare. I returned to my dining room table and the stack of geometry tests, but found myself working more efficiently than usual, as if James's visit had somehow recalibrated my energy. My students had been wrestling with conditional statements and logical reasoning, trying to understand how to build arguments that would hold up under scrutiny. As I worked through their proofs, marking their logical progressions and noting where their reasoning broke down, I found myself thinking about the assumptions we make about other people based on limited information. What assumptions had I made about James based on his job, his age, his appearance? What assumptions was he making about me? The mathematics of human connection seemed far more complex than anything I taught in my classroom, with variables that shifted depending on context and emotional states that couldn't be quantified in any meaningful way. By evening, I'd finished grading the entire stack of tests and had begun planning Monday's lesson on the relationship between hypothesis and conclusion. But my mind kept drifting back to James's observation about groceries revealing personal information. His intuitive understanding of my transition from cooking for two to cooking for one. His matter-of-fact acknowledgement of weekend loneliness without making it sound like a problem that needed solving. as I prepared my usual Saturday evening dinner of salad and whatever protein seemed least depressing to cook for one person, I realized I was already looking forward to next Saturday's delivery. Not because I needed groceries particularly, but because I wanted to continue the conversation we'd started. When had that happened? When had I gone from dreading human interaction to anticipating it? The thought should have worried me more than it did. Instead, as I settled into my evening routine of reading and early bedtime, I found myself wondering what James did with his Saturday evenings, whether he graded papers, or watched movies, or called friends from college. The curiosity felt rusty but pleasant, like a muscle I hadn't used in months finally beginning to stretch and remember its function. Outside my bedroom window, the October evening settled into the comfortable darkness of early fall, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I fell asleep looking forward to something specific, rather than simply hoping to get through another week. Mathematics might offer clear solutions to defined problems, but human connection, I was beginning to remember, operated by entirely different rules. Rules that might be worth relearning, even at 55, even after everything I thought I knew about love and loneliness had been proven incorrect. The proof, as my students would say, was still in progress. But for the first time in months, I was genuinely curious to see how the logic would unfold. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of persistent drizzle that made Portland famous. The sort of weather that encouraged staying inside with books and warm drinks. I'd always loved these gray mornings during my marriage, when David and I would read the newspaper together over coffee and debate the editorial sections. Now, the routine felt hollow, performed for an audience of one who had stopped caring about current events or intellectual discussions months ago. I found myself scrolling through news headlines on my tablet without really absorbing the information, my mind wandering back to yesterday's unexpected conversation with James. Emma called at precisely 9 a.m., as she had every Sunday since the divorce papers were finalized. My younger sister had appointed herself my emotional wellness coordinator, a role she took seriously despite living 3 hours away in Seattle with her husband Marcus and their twin 10-year-olds. Emma worked as a child psychologist, which meant she approached my post-divorce adjustment with professional concern disguised as sisterly worry. "How was your week, Kat?" Her voice carried that careful tone she used when she wasn't sure if she was calling during a good day or a crisis day. "Did you get out of the house at all besides work?" "I had groceries delivered yesterday," I said, settling into my favorite reading chair by the living room window. "Had a nice conversation with the delivery driver, actually. Much more pleasant than facing the weekend crowds at the store." "That's good. Small social interactions count for a lot during transitions." Emma slipped into therapist mode so seamlessly that I wondered if she even noticed anymore. "Was this the same driver from last week?" "No. This was my first delivery. His name is James. Very polite. Seemed genuinely interested in conversation rather than just rushing through his route." I found myself smiling at the memory of his careful attention to organizing my groceries, his observation about my being a teacher. He's actually an education major, looking for teaching positions while doing delivery work. There was a pause on Emma's end, and I could practically hear her switching into big sister alert mode. "How old is this James?" "I don't know, mid-20s. Probably. Why does that matter?" But even as I asked the question, I felt defensive in a way that suggested I knew exactly why it mattered. "Kat, I'm not judging anything. I'm just checking in on your social interactions because isolation isn't healthy long-term." Emma's voice remained carefully neutral. "It's good that you're having pleasant conversations with people. Just remember that you're in a vulnerable place right now, and it's easy to read more into friendly interactions than what's actually there." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering my sleep patterns, my appetite, my plans for the upcoming week. Emma meant well, but her professional training made every conversation feel like a psychological evaluation disguised as family concern. After we hung up, I sat staring out at the rain-soaked neighborhood and wondering if I really was so transparent that a simple mention of a grocery delivery driver had triggered her protective instincts. Monday through Friday passed in the familiar rhythm of teaching, grading, and evening solitude that had become my new normal. Roosevelt High buzzed with the particular energy of early fall semester, when students still held hope that this year would be different, that mathematics might finally make sense, that college applications and SAT scores wouldn't determine their entire futures. I threw myself into lesson planning with renewed focus, creating engaging activities for my Algebra 2 and Calculus classes, staying late to help struggling students understand the logical progression of mathematical proofs. Teaching had always been my sanctuary, the one place where I felt completely competent and useful. Teenagers might be dramatic and unpredictable in every other aspect of their lives, but mathematics remained constant. Every equation had a solution. Every problem could be worked through step by step. Every proof could be verified through logical reasoning. Unlike marriage, unlike trust, unlike the assumptions I'd made about my future, mathematics never lied or changed the rules halfway through the game. Wednesday afternoon, I found myself in the teacher's lounge during my planning period, listening to Maria Santos and Jennifer Walsh discuss their weekend plans. Maria taught Spanish and had been married to her high school sweetheart for 15 years. Jennifer was the newest addition to our English department, fresh out of graduate school and still optimistic about changing the world through literature. "You should come with us to the wine bar on Friday night, Kat," Maria suggested, looking up from the stack of essays she was grading. Jennifer's never been to Vine Street, and we need a third person to make it feel social instead of just two colleagues getting drunk together. "I appreciate the invitation, but Friday nights are for Netflix and early bedtime these days," I replied, which was true but sounded more pathetic spoken aloud than it did in my head. "When was the last time you did something just for fun?" Jennifer asked with the earnest concern of someone still young enough to believe that fun was a moral imperative. Not productive, not educational, not self-improving, just purely enjoyable. The question caught me off guard because I honestly couldn't remember. Even during the last few years of my marriage, David and I had scheduled fun like a chore to be completed. Date nights that felt obligatory. Vacation plans that centered around his medical conferences. Social gatherings where I smiled appropriately while feeling increasingly disconnected from my own life. "I'll think about it," I said, which we all knew meant no, but allowed the conversation to move on without further psychological analysis of my social isolation. By Saturday morning, I'd placed another Fresh Mart order, telling myself it was purely practical. I needed milk, fresh vegetables, and the good bread from the bakery section that I couldn't get at the corner convenience store. The fact that I'd specifically requested a delivery window between 2 and 4 p.m., the same time slot as the previous week, was simply convenient scheduling. Nothing more. I spent the morning cleaning house with an energy that surprised me, organizing bookshelves that didn't need organizing, wiping down surfaces that were already clean, changing from my comfortable weekend clothes into jeans and a sweater that actually fit properly instead of hanging loose from my post-divorce weight loss. The activity felt purposeful rather than nervous, like preparing to receive a guest rather than hiding from the world. At exactly 2:15, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find James standing on my porch again, this time wearing a light jacket against the October chill and carrying 3 bags instead of 2. His smile was immediate and genuine, as if seeing me again was actually pleasant rather than just part of his job. "Ms. Mills, good to see you again. How was your week?" He stepped inside after my invitation, already moving toward the kitchen, with the practiced efficiency of someone who remembered the layout of my house. "Please call me Kat. Ms. Mills makes me feel like I'm at a parent conference." I followed him into the kitchen, noting that he'd remembered to wipe his feet without prompting. My week was good, busy with classes starting to hit their stride. How about you? Any luck with the job applications? A few promising interviews, actually. There's a position opening up at Westfield Elementary in December, when one of their 3rd grade teachers goes on maternity leave. James began unpacking groceries with the same careful attention to organization I remembered from the week before. "It's just a temporary position through the end of the school year, but it would be actual classroom experience." "That's wonderful. 3rd grade is such a crucial year for building mathematical foundations. Students either develop confidence with numbers or start believing they're not math people based on how fractions and multiplication are introduced." I realized I was launching into teacher mode and tried to pull back. "Sorry, I get passionate about early mathematics education. Don't apologize. It's refreshing to talk to someone who cares about education as more than just a job." James paused in his unpacking to look at me directly. Most people hear elementary teacher and assume I'm either marking time until something better comes along or couldn't handle a real career. The frustration in his voice was familiar. I'd spent decades defending my choice to teach high school mathematics instead of pursuing more lucrative applications of my degree. People assumed teaching was a fallback option, a safe choice for people who couldn't succeed in the private sector. They didn't understand the intellectual challenge of making complex concepts accessible, the emotional investment required to guide adolescents through their most confusing developmental years, the profound satisfaction of watching understanding dawn in a student's eyes. Teaching is absolutely a real career, I said firmly. Anyone who thinks otherwise has never tried to explain long division to 28 third graders while managing behavior issues and documenting learning objectives for 3 different ability levels. James laughed, a warm sound that filled my kitchen more pleasantly than the morning news programs David used to play. Exactly. Plus, there's the parents who want to know why their child isn't reading at a 6th grade level by October, the administrators, who think test scores are the only measure of learning, and the budget constraints that mean buying your own supplies half the time. But then you have those moments when everything clicks, I continued, feeling energized by talking to someone who understood the profession from the inside. When a student who struggled all semester suddenly grasps a concept and you can see their confidence transform, those moments make up for all the bureaucracy and budget cuts. Those are the moments that keep you going, James agreed. I had a student during my practice teaching who was convinced he was terrible at math. Turned out he was dyslexic and had been processing numbers differently than everyone else. Once we figured out some accommodation strategies, he became one of my strongest problem solvers. I found myself genuinely interested in James's teaching experiences, impressed by his intuitive understanding of how learning differences affected academic performance. Too many new teachers focused only on curriculum delivery, without considering the individual needs of their students. But James seemed to grasp the fundamental truth that effective teaching required adapting methods to match learners, rather than expecting all students to learn the same way. "Would you like some coffee?" I asked, realizing we'd been standing in my kitchen talking for nearly 15 minutes. "I made a fresh pot this morning, and it seems silly to let it go to waste." "That sounds really nice, actually. If you're sure I'm not keeping you from anything important." The most important thing on my Saturday agenda is grading calculus tests, which is hardly urgent. I busied myself with mugs and cream, aware that James was taking in the details of my kitchen, with the same careful attention he'd given to my groceries. Besides, it's nice to have someone to talk to who understands the world of education. Most of my neighbors think teachers work part-time and have summers off. "The eternal misconception," James said, accepting a mug of coffee with obvious appreciation. "My mom's a nurse, and she always said teachers and healthcare workers were the only professionals expected to justify their schedules to strangers. Your mother sounds wise. What kind of nursing does she do?" "Pediatric ICU at OHSU. She's been there for almost 20 years now." James's voice carried obvious pride and affection. "Single mom, raised me and my younger sister mostly on her own after my dad decided family life wasn't for him." The casual mention of his father's abandonment was delivered without self-pity, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested old hurt carefully managed. I recognized the look from my own mirror during the months when David's infidelity was still a fresh wound rather than an accepted fact. "That must have been difficult for all of you," I said gently, not wanting to pry but acknowledging the significance of what he'd shared. "It was hard when I was younger, but honestly, we were better off without him. He was the kind of person who made everyone else feel like they were never quite good enough." James sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "My mom always said the best thing he did for us was leave before we grew up thinking his behavior was normal." First attraction moment. The October afternoon light streaming through my kitchen window caught the auburn highlights in James's hair as he spoke about his family. And I found myself noticing details that had nothing to do with polite conversation. The way his hands wrapped around the coffee mug with surprising elegance. The slight dimple that appeared when he smiled genuinely rather than professionally. The intelligence in his hazel eyes when he talked about teaching strategies and student advocacy. When had I stopped noticing these things about people? During the last years of my marriage, I'd trained myself to look past physical attraction, to focus on practical matters like mortgage payments and retirement planning instead of the way someone's laugh made me feel. David had been handsome once, but familiarity and resentment had dulled my awareness of him as anything other than a roommate who happened to share my last name. But sitting across from James in my sun-filled kitchen, I felt something stirring that I'd almost forgotten existed. Not just appreciation for his thoughtful conversation, or gratitude for his genuine interest in my work, but something more fundamental, an awareness of him as a man rather than simply a pleasant stranger. The realization should have been alarming, but instead it felt like waking up from a long sleep. "You have a beautiful house," James said, glancing around the kitchen and into the living room visible through the doorway. "It feels very peaceful, like a place where someone could actually think clearly." "Thank you. It's been home for almost 15 years now, though it feels different lately." I followed his gaze, trying to see my space through his eyes. "Quieter than it used to be." Quiet can be good, though. After growing up in a house with 3 women, I've learned to appreciate silence. James's smile was slightly teasing. "My mom, my sister, and my grandmother all lived with us until I graduated high school. Between the nursing schedules and teenager drama and my grandmother's soap opera commentaries, there was always something happening." "That sounds wonderfully chaotic," I said, and meant it. I always wondered what it would be like to have a full house, lots of family around all the time. "You don't have children?" The question was asked gently, without the invasive curiosity that usually accompanied inquiries about my childless state. "No, we tried for years, but it just wasn't meant to happen." The standard response came easily after decades of practice, but something about James's genuine interest made me want to elaborate. "I used to think I'd missed out on something essential, but teaching has given me the chance to influence hundreds of young people over the years. Different kind of legacy, I suppose." "That's a beautiful way to look at it. Some of my most influential relationships were with teachers who saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself." James leaned forward slightly, his attention completely focused on our conversation. "Mrs. Rodriguez, my 5th grade teacher, was the first person who suggested I might be good at working with kids. She saw me helping struggling classmates with math problems and told me I had natural teaching instincts. She was right, obviously. Your students are going to be lucky to have you." I meant it completely, impressed by his intuitive understanding of how to connect with people regardless of age. "You have that rare combination of patience and genuine interest that makes people feel heard." "That's one of the nicest compliments anyone's given me," James said, and I could tell he meant it. "Especially coming from someone with your experience. 28 years in the classroom means you've seen every type of teacher imaginable." The conversation had shifted into something more personal than polite small talk, and I realized I was reluctant to see it end. James seemed equally comfortable, settling back in his chair with his coffee, as if he had nowhere else to be. The afternoon light was beginning to shift toward evening, casting longer shadows across my kitchen table, but neither of us made any move to wrap up our interaction. "Can I ask you something?" James said after a comfortable pause. "What made you choose mathematics? It's not exactly the most popular subject among high schoolers." "Honestly? Mathematics was the only subject that made complete sense to me. Literature was beautiful but subjective. History was important but depressing. Science was fascinating but required too much memorization." I traced the rim of my coffee mug with one finger, thinking about how to explain a lifelong passion to someone who might not share it. But mathematics was pure logic. Every problem had a solution, every equation balanced, every proof could be verified. There was comfort in that certainty. And now, after everything that's happened in your personal life, do you still find that certainty comforting? The question was perceptive enough to surprise me. Most people didn't make the connection between mathematical thinking and emotional processing. But James seemed to understand that my professional choice reflected something deeper about how I approach the world. More than ever, actually, when everything else feels unpredictable, it's reassuring to work with problems that definitely have answers, even if finding those answers requires patience and persistence. I looked at James directly, struck by how easy it was to be honest with him. Mathematics doesn't lie or change the rules, or decide it wants something different after 30 years of consistent behavior. "Unlike people," James said quietly, and something in his tone suggested he'd learned that lesson personally. "Unlike people," I agreed. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who'd both experienced the fundamental unreliability of human promises, but were still willing to risk conversation with a relative stranger. The irony wasn't lost on me that I felt more understood by my grocery delivery driver than I had by my husband during the final years of our marriage. "I should probably let you get back to your Saturday," James said eventually, though he made no immediate move to leave. "I have a few more deliveries to make before my shift ends. Of course, I don't want to keep you from your work." But even as I said it, I felt disappointed by the prospect of returning to my empty house and stack of calculus tests. "This has been really nice, though. I can't remember the last time I had such a genuinely interesting conversation." "Same. Here," James said, standing and collecting his delivery bags. "Most of my social interactions these days are either work-related or family obligations. It's refreshing to talk to someone who's interesting by choice, rather than necessity." The comment could have been simple politeness, but something in his delivery suggested he meant it. As I walked him to the front door, I found myself hoping he really would be handling my future deliveries. Not just because the conversation had been pleasant, but because I genuinely wanted to know how his teaching interviews progressed. Whether he got the position at Westfield Elementary, what other insights he might share about education and life, and the challenge of building meaningful connections in an increasingly isolated world. "Good luck with the job applications," I said as he prepared to leave. "That temporary position could easily turn into something permanent if you impress them." "Thanks for the encouragement, and thanks for the coffee and conversation. I'll probably see you next Saturday if you're planning another delivery." "I'll probably need groceries again by then," I said, which was true but not the whole truth. What I needed was another excuse to continue this unexpected connection with someone who seemed to see me as an interesting person, rather than a cautionary tale about late-life divorce. After James left, I returned to my kitchen and began putting away the groceries he'd delivered. The routine task felt different somehow, less like maintaining a household for one and more like preparing for a life that might include unexpected visitors and spontaneous conversations. I found myself considering what to order for next weekend, not just based on nutritional needs, but on what might prompt further discussion about teaching, family, or the small observations that revealed character. The stack of calculus tests still waited on my dining room table, but I approached them with renewed energy rather than resigned duty. My students were working through optimization problems, learning to find maximum and minimum values within given constraints. As I graded their work, I found myself thinking about the constraints I'd placed on my own life since the divorce, the way I'd optimized for safety and solitude rather than growth or connection. Mathematics might offer clear solutions to defined problems, but human relationships operated within much more complex parameters. James had introduced variables I hadn't considered in months, possibilities that couldn't be calculated through standard formulas. The realization should have been unsettling, but instead it felt like the beginning of a proof I was actually curious to complete. Emotional bridge building. By Thursday of the following week, I'd started paying attention to things that hadn't seemed important in months. The way my hair looked when I ran my fingers through it while grading papers. Whether my weekend clothes were actively unflattering or simply comfortable. The fact that I'd unconsciously begun placing another Fresh Mart order, this time including items I didn't particularly need, but might prompt interesting conversation. The awareness of my own awareness felt strange, like discovering I'd been walking around with my eyes closed and was only now beginning to see my surroundings clearly. During faculty meetings, I caught myself noticing how other people interacted, the small gestures and verbal cues that indicated genuine interest versus professional politeness. Jennifer Walsh had started dating someone new and couldn't stop mentioning him in casual conversation. Maria Santos and her husband still held hands when he picked her up from school. Even Mrs. Patterson, who'd been teaching chemistry for 40 years, seemed to light up when she talked about her weekend plans with her book club. When had I stopped noticing these signs of connection and contentment in other people's lives? When had I become so focused on simply getting through each day that I'd forgotten to pay attention to the possibilities surrounding me? Friday afternoon, I stayed late in my classroom to help two students work through a particularly challenging set of logarithmic equations. Ashley Chen was a perfectionist who became frustrated when mathematical concepts didn't immediately make sense, while Marcus Williams approached problems with creative thinking that sometimes led to brilliant insights and sometimes to complete confusion. Working with both of them required patience and different explanatory strategies, but I found the challenge energizing rather than exhausting. Ms. Mills, can I ask you something personal? Ashley said as she packed up her books. How do you stay so calm when people don't understand things right away? My mom gets really impatient when she tries to help me with homework. The question caught me off guard. Not because it was inappropriate, but because it suggested my students saw me as someone who possessed emotional skills worth emulating. During the worst months of my marriage, when David's criticism had become constant background noise, I'd begun to doubt my competence in every area of my life. But here was a bright 17-year-old seeking advice about patience and emotional regulation. I think it helps to remember that everyone's brain works differently, I said, considering my answer carefully. What makes sense to me immediately might be completely confusing to you, and vice versa. The goal isn't to understand everything. Instantly, it's to keep trying different approaches until something clicks. Like relationships? Marcus asked with the insight that sometimes surprised me in teenagers. My parents are always saying that good relationships require patience and trying different approaches when something isn't working. Exactly like relationships, I agreed, struck by the accuracy of his comparison. Mathematics and human connection both require persistence, creativity, and the willingness to admit when your first approach isn't working. After the students left, I sat in my empty classroom thinking about Marcus's observation. When had I stopped applying mathematical problem-solving strategies to my personal life? During the final years of my marriage, I'd given up trying different approaches to connect with David, had accepted that our communication patterns were fixed and unchangeable. But what if I'd been wrong? What if there were still possibilities I hadn't considered, connections I hadn't attempted? Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that made staying inside feel like a moral imperative rather than social avoidance. I'd placed my Fresh Mart order on Wednesday, including ingredients for homemade soup and fresh bread, telling myself I was simply preparing for the changing season. The fact that I'd also ordered good coffee and the kind of cookies that might prompt someone to linger over conversation was purely practical planning. At exactly 2:30, James arrived with my weekly delivery, this time wearing a rain jacket that made him look younger and more vulnerable than his usual professional appearance. His smile was immediate and warm despite the dreary weather, as if seeing me again was genuinely the highlight of his afternoon. "Wet day for deliveries," I said, stepping aside to let him into the warmth of my house. "I hope you're staying dry out there." "Mostly dry, thanks to good gear and heated car seats," James replied, shaking raindrops off his jacket before hanging it on the coat hook I'd started leaving empty by the front door. "October in Portland is definitely character-building weather. Perfect day for soup and staying inside," I said, leading him toward the kitchen. "I was just thinking about making a pot of vegetable soup with some of the ingredients you're delivering." "That sounds amazing. I've been living on sandwiches and takeout for weeks now." James began unpacking groceries with his usual careful attention, but I noticed he was taking more time than necessary, organizing items in neat categories across my counter. My cooking skills pretty much peak at scrambled eggs and pasta with jarred sauce. "Cooking for one person takes practice," I said, trying not to read too much into his admission that he was also eating solitary meals. "It's easy to fall into convenience food habits when you're not feeding anyone else." "Exactly. When I was living at home, my mom did most of the cooking, and my sister was always experimenting with new recipes she'd seen online. I got spoiled by having real meals every night." James paused in his unpacking to look at me directly. "Do you miss cooking for someone else, or is it liberating to only have to please yourself?" The question was more personal than our previous conversations, but it felt natural rather than intrusive. James had a gift for asking about emotional experiences without making them feel like therapy sessions or interrogations. "Both, honestly," I said, considering my answer while I prepared coffee for both of us. "I miss the satisfaction of making something delicious and watching someone enjoy it. But I also love being able to eat dinner at 9 p.m. if I want to, or have ice cream for breakfast without anyone commenting on my choices." "Ice cream for breakfast sounds like the ultimate adult freedom," James said with a laugh that filled my kitchen with warmth. "Though I have to admit, I've been eating cereal for dinner more often than I care to admit." Nothing wrong with breakfast, food at unconventional times. Some of my best meals have been pancakes at midnight, or soup at 7 a.m. I handed him a mug of coffee, noting how our fingers brushed briefly during the exchange. The benefit of living alone is that all the rules become suggestions. I never thought about it that way, but you're right. No one to judge your choices except yourself. James settled into what was becoming his usual chair at my kitchen table, as if we'd been having these Saturday afternoon conversations for months instead of weeks. How long have you been living alone? About 6 months now. The divorce was finalized in March, but David moved out last October. The timeline still felt surreal when I said it aloud, as if the past year had happened to someone else. Some days it feels like forever. Other days it feels like I'm still figuring out the basics of solo living. That must be a huge adjustment after being married for. James let the question hang, giving me the choice of how much personal information to share. 32 years. We got married right after I finished my teaching degree. I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug, using the warmth to steady myself for what felt like important honesty. Long enough that I'd forgotten who I was before I became half of a couple. That's a long time to build a shared identity, James said gently. It makes sense that rediscovering your individual preferences would take time and patience. His response struck me as remarkably mature for someone who'd never been married. Never had to untangle decades of shared routines and assumptions. But then, James seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of human nature that probably served him well in his teaching aspirations. What about you? I asked, curious about his relationship experience but trying to phrase the question casually. Have you ever been in a long-term relationship, or are you still figuring out what you want? In that department, I had a serious girlfriend through most of college, but we broke up last year when she got accepted to graduate school in Chicago, and I decided to stay in Portland. James's tone was matter-of-fact rather than bitter, suggesting he'd processed the disappointment and moved forward. We wanted different things, ultimately. She was focused on building an impressive career in urban planning, and I was more interested in finding meaningful work that felt sustainable long-term. Those are fundamental differences in values, I observed. It's better to discover incompatibilities before making major life commitments than to realize them years into a marriage. Exactly what my mom said. She liked Sarah well enough, but she always thought we were trying too hard to make a relationship work that should have felt more natural. James sipped his coffee thoughtfully. I think I learned more about what I don't want in a partner than what I do want, if that makes sense. Perfect sense. Sometimes the process of elimination is more valuable than positive examples. I found myself genuinely curious about James's relationship criteria, interested in understanding how someone his age approached romantic compatibility. What did you learn about your preferences? That I value genuine conversation over impressive achievements. That I'd rather be with someone who's comfortable with quiet evenings at home than someone who needs constant entertainment and social stimulation. James paused, seeming to consider how much honesty the moment warranted. And that age is less important to me than emotional maturity and shared values. The last comment hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that neither of us immediately acknowledged. I felt my pulse quicken slightly, wondering if James was making a general observation about relationships or speaking more specifically about his attraction to older women. The possibility that our weekly conversations meant more to him than professional friendliness was both thrilling and terrifying. Those are wise insights, I said carefully, trying to keep my response neutral while my mind raced through various interpretations of his words. Emotional compatibility is definitely more important than superficial similarities. I think so. My mom always dated men close to her own age, but she said the best relationship she ever had was with a guy who was 8 years younger. He was more emotionally available than most of the men her age, who seemed to think that reaching 40 meant they were done growing as people. James was definitely steering our conversation toward the topic of age differences in relationships, but I couldn't determine whether he was speaking hypothetically or testing my reaction to more personal possibilities. The uncertainty was both nerve-wracking and exhilarating in a way I hadn't experienced since my 20s. Age gaps can work when both people are mature and communicating openly, I said, choosing my words carefully. The challenge is usually dealing with external judgment from people who think relationships should follow conventional timelines and expectations. External judgment is overrated, James said with quiet conviction. People are going to have opinions about your choices, regardless of what you do. Might as well make decisions based on what actually makes you happy, instead of what looks appropriate to strangers. The philosophy was simultaneously simple and radical, especially coming from someone young enough to care deeply about peer approval and social acceptance. But James seemed genuinely indifferent to conventional expectations, more interested in authentic connection than impressive appearances. Our conversation continued for another hour, meandering through topics ranging from teaching challenges to family dynamics to our respective opinions about Portland's rapidly changing cultural landscape. James was easy to talk to in a way that felt rare and precious, someone who listened with genuine attention rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. He asked thoughtful follow-up questions and offered insights that suggested he'd been paying attention not just to my words, but to the emotions underneath them. By the time he prepared to leave, the afternoon had shifted toward evening, and I realized I'd completely forgotten about the calculus tests I'd planned to grade or the household tasks I'd intended to complete. Instead, I'd spent 3 hours in engaging conversation with someone who seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and experiences, someone whose company I'd begun to anticipate with something that felt dangerously close to excitement. "Same time next week?" James asked as he gathered his delivery bags, his tone casual, but his eyes holding what seemed like genuine hope for my affirmative response. "I'll probably need groceries again by then," I said, which was becoming our standard exchange, but felt increasingly loaded with subtext neither of us was quite ready to make explicit. After he left, I found myself standing in my kitchen longer than necessary, replaying our conversation and analyzing every comment that might have carried deeper meaning. The rational part of my mind insisted I was reading too much into friendly customer service and professional politeness. But another part of me, a part that had been dormant for months, recognized the unmistakable signs of mutual attraction and genuine connection. The recognition should have been alarming, should have triggered all my carefully constructed defenses against emotional vulnerability. Instead, as I finally turned my attention to the evening's grading and household routine, I felt energized by the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as finished with romance as I'd convinced myself to believe. Romantic possibility. Acknowledged, the week passed with unusual awareness of small details that had been invisible for months. I caught myself checking my reflection in classroom windows between periods, wondering if the fluorescent lighting was particularly unflattering, or if I'd simply stopped paying attention to my appearance somewhere along the way. During lunch, duty. I found myself observing how my younger colleagues interacted with each other, noting the subtle flirtations and genuine friendships that made the faculty lounge feel warm rather than merely functional. Wednesday afternoon, while helping a student work through a complex calculus problem involving related rates, I realized I'd been thinking about James's comment regarding age differences more than was probably healthy. The student, Kevin Park, was struggling to understand how to find the rate at which a balloon's volume was changing when only given information about its radius. The problem required understanding relationships between variables that changed at different rates, but remained mathematically connected. The key, I explained to Kevin, is recognizing that two things can change at completely different speeds while still maintaining a predictable relationship to each other. The radius increases slowly and steadily, but the volume changes much, more dramatically because of the cubic relationship. As I spoke, I realized the mathematical concept was an almost perfect metaphor for what seemed to be developing between James and me. We were changing at different rates, coming from different starting points, but there was definitely some kind of relationship forming between variables that had initially seemed completely independent. So even though they're changing differently, they're still connected by the underlying equation? Kevin asked, demonstrating the kind of insight that made teaching worthwhile. Exactly. The connection exists whether or not it's immediately obvious to outside observers. After Kevin left, I sat alone in my classroom wondering when I'd started thinking of my interactions with James in mathematical terms. The analytical approach felt safer than examining the emotional reality directly, but it also suggested I was taking our connection seriously enough to apply my most trusted problem-solving strategies. Friday evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I went shopping for clothes. Nothing dramatic or expensive, just a trip to the department store to find a sweater that fit properly, and jeans that didn't look like I'd given up on ever, being attractive again. The shopping expedition felt simultaneously empowering and ridiculous, like a teenager preparing for a first date, while telling herself it was just a coincidence that she looked nice on the day the cute boy had calculus class. Maria Santos noticed my new sweater immediately when I wore it to Saturday morning book club at Corner Coffee. "That color is beautiful on you, Kat. Very sophisticated but approachable." She paused in stirring her latte to study my appearance. More carefully. "You look different lately. More energetic, maybe? Like you're sleeping better or eating more regularly." "I've been feeling more settled, I think. Getting used to the routine of living alone, I suppose." The explanation was true, but incomplete. What I didn't mention was that my improved mood had less to do with accepting solitude and more to do with anticipating Saturday afternoon conversations with my grocery delivery driver. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep it up. You seem more like yourself than you have in years." Maria's observation was delivered with the matter-of-fact kindness that made her such an effective teacher and valued friend. Sometimes major life changes take a while to settle into something positive. After book club, I returned home to clean house with an attention to detail that would have impressed my mother. Not the desperate cleaning of someone trying to distract herself from depression, but the purposeful preparation of someone expecting a guest she actually wanted to see. I arranged fresh flowers from my garden in a vase on the kitchen table, not because James would necessarily notice, but because the splash of color made the space feel more welcoming. At 2:25, I found myself checking my reflection in the hallway mirror one final time, smoothing down hair that didn't need smoothing and adjusting a sweater that fit perfectly well. The self-consciousness felt strange after months of barely noticing my appearance, but it also felt like waking up from a long hibernation. The doorbell rang at exactly 2:30, and I opened it to find James standing on my porch with 4 bags instead of his usual 2 or 3. He was wearing dark jeans and a forest green Henley that brought out the color of his eyes, and I noticed he'd gotten a haircut since our last meeting. The attention to his appearance felt significant, though I tried not to read too much into what might simply be coincidence. "Busy grocery week," James said with a smile that seemed brighter than usual. "Looks like you're either hosting a dinner party or planning to hibernate until spring." "Neither, actually. I just felt inspired to try some new recipes." I stepped aside to let him in, catching a hint of cologne or aftershave that was subtle, but definitely intentional. "Plus, I figured if I'm going to keep you here talking for an hour every week, the least I can do is offer you something more interesting than coffee and store-bought cookies." The acknowledgement that our conversations had become a regular occurrence hung between us as James moved toward the kitchen. He'd acknowledged the pattern too, but hearing it spoken aloud made the intentionality impossible to ignore. "I was hoping you'd say that," James said, beginning to unpack groceries with his usual methodical care. "These Saturday deliveries have become the highlight of my week, if I'm being honest." The admission sent warmth through my chest that had nothing to do with the heated house. James was being more direct than usual, moving beyond polite customer service into something that felt distinctly personal. "Mine too," I said simply, deciding that honesty was less risky than continued pretense that our interactions were purely professional. "I look forward to our conversations all week." James paused in his unpacking to look at me directly, his expression serious but warm. "Can I ask you something that might be completely inappropriate?" My heart rate increased noticeably, but I nodded for him to continue. "Would you be interested in having dinner sometime? Not here, not as part of a grocery delivery, but as two people who enjoy each other's company and want to spend more time together." James's voice was steady, but I could see the vulnerability in his eyes. "I know the situation is unusual, and I completely understand if you'd rather keep things professional." The question I'd been half expecting and half dreading hung in the air between us. James was asking me on a date, clearly and directly, removing any possibility that I was misinterpreting. Friendly customer service as romantic interest. The moment required a response that would either move us forward into uncharted territory or establish boundaries that would change everything about our Saturday afternoons. "I would like that very much," I heard myself say, the words coming out with more confidence than I felt. "Though I have to warn you that I haven't been on an actual date in over 30 years. "Then we'll figure it out together," James said, his relief evident in the way his shoulders relaxed. I haven't exactly been dating much lately either. The acknowledgement that we were both entering unfamiliar territory felt reassuring rather than daunting. Neither of us had expectations based on extensive recent experience, which meant we could approach whatever this was becoming without predetermined scripts or assumptions about how it should unfold. "There's something I need to tell you, though," I said, feeling the need for complete honesty before we moved forward. "I'm 55 years old, James. That's not a small age difference we're talking about." "I know exactly how old you are, Kat," James said gently. "And I'm 28, in case you were wondering. That's 27 years between us, which sounds like a lot when you say it that way." 28. He was even younger than I'd estimated, which made his emotional maturity and genuine interest in me even more remarkable. 27 years was indeed a significant gap, enough to generate serious judgment from people who believed relationships should follow conventional patterns. "It doesn't bother you?" I asked, needing to understand his perspective before I could process my own feelings about the age difference. "The number bothers me less than the possibility that it bothers you," James replied. "I'm attracted to you, Kat. Not to some idea of what dating an older woman might be like, but to you specifically. Your intelligence, your kindness, the way you listen when people talk, the way you make me feel like my thoughts and opinions actually matter." His honesty was both touching and overwhelming. When had someone last told me I was attractive for reasons that had nothing to do with physical appearance? David had stopped offering genuine compliments years before our marriage ended, and most of my interactions since the divorce had been professional or sympathetic rather than romantic. "You make me feel like myself again," I said quietly. "Like someone worth talking to, worth spending time with." I'd forgotten what that felt like. "Then let's see where this goes," James suggested. "No pressure, no expectations beyond enjoying each other's company. If anyone has a problem with us having dinner together, that's their issue to deal with." The simplicity of his approach was appealing. Instead of analyzing all the potential complications and social judgments, we could simply focus on whether we enjoyed being together. The mathematical part of my mind appreciated the elegance of reducing a complex situation to its essential variables. "All right," I said, feeling like I was stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "When did you have in mind? Are you free next Friday evening? There's a small Italian place downtown that's supposed to have excellent food and quiet atmosphere. Perfect for actual conversation." Friday sounds wonderful. The commitment felt both thrilling and terrifying, like signing up for an advanced mathematics course without knowing whether I remembered enough algebra to handle the prerequisites. We spent the rest of the afternoon talking with a new undercurrent of acknowledged attraction that changed everything about our interaction. James seemed more relaxed, more willing to share personal stories and opinions. I felt more present in my own skin, more aware of my gestures and expressions, more conscious of the chemistry that had been building between us for weeks. When James finally prepared to leave, our goodbye felt weighted with anticipation rather than simple politeness. As he reached the front door, he turned back toward me with a slightly mischievous expression. "Just so we're completely clear," he said, "this is me asking you on a real date. Not a friendly dinner between acquaintances, not a thank you meal for being a good customer. I'm interested in you romantically, and I wanted to make sure you understood that." The directness was refreshing after months of careful politeness and professional boundaries. James was being absolutely honest about his intentions, giving me the opportunity to change my mind if his romantic interest was unwelcome. "I understand completely," I replied. "And yes, I'm interested in you romantically too. It feels strange to say that, but there it is." "Good," James said with a smile that made my pulse quicken. "I'll pick you up at 7 on Friday, if that works for you." 7 is perfect. After he left, I stood in my entryway for several minutes, processing what had just occurred. In the space of one afternoon, my grocery delivery driver had become my Friday night date, transforming our careful friendship into something entirely different. The shift felt significant enough to require serious consideration, but also natural. Enough that I wasn't inclined to second-guess the decision. I called Emma that evening, knowing she'd want to hear about any developments in my social life, but uncertain how much detail to share about James's age or our unconventional meeting story. "I have a date on Friday," I announced without preamble, when she answered the phone. "Kat, that's wonderful. Tell me everything. Who is he? Where did you meet him? What does he do?" Emma's excitement was immediate and genuine, the response of someone who'd been worried about my isolation and was thrilled to hear about any romantic possibility. His name is James. He's very sweet and thoughtful, and we met through a completely ordinary situation that just developed into something more. The explanation was true but strategically vague, avoiding the details that might trigger Emma's protective instincts. How old is he? What kind of work does he do? Emma was slipping into her psychological assessment mode, gathering data to evaluate whether this James person was likely to be good for my emotional recovery. He's younger than me, and he's working in education while looking for a permanent teaching position. Again, true but incomplete. James was indeed working in education, just not in the traditional classroom setting Emma would probably assume. Younger is good. Men your age are often carrying too much relationship baggage, or they're looking for women significantly younger than themselves. Emma's approval was reassuring, even though she didn't know the full extent of our age difference. Where is he taking you? A small Italian restaurant downtown. Nothing too formal or intimidating. I found myself smiling as I described our plans, anticipating Friday evening with an excitement I hadn't felt in years. I'm so happy for you, Kat. You deserve to have fun and feel attractive and appreciated again. Just promise me you'll trust your instincts and not settle for anyone who doesn't treat you amazingly well. I promise. James is very respectful and kind. I think you'd like him. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Emma offering dating advice and encouragement that was both helpful and slightly overwhelming. After we hung up, I realized I'd successfully avoided mentioning James's exact age or how we'd met, details that would definitely have triggered longer conversations about appropriate boundaries and potential complications. Emma meant well, but she had strong opinions about age-appropriate relationships and professional boundaries that might not align with my current situation. The rest of the week passed with an undercurrent of anticipation that affected everything from my teaching, energy to my evening routines. I found myself paying attention to my wardrobe with renewed interest, considering what might be appropriate for a first date that was both exciting and nerve-wracking. My students noticed my improved mood, commenting that I seemed more patient with their questions and more enthusiastic about our coursework. "Ms. Mills, you're glowing today," Ashley Chen observed after I'd worked through a particularly complex problem with unusual animation. "Did something good happen?" "I'm just having a good week," I replied, which was certainly true. Sometimes everything aligns in a way that makes you feel optimistic about life. "My mom says that happens when you're falling in love," Marcus Williams added with the casual wisdom that teenagers sometimes possessed. "She looked exactly like you do right now when she started dating my stepdad." The observation was more perceptive than I was prepared to handle, but also reassuring in its suggestion that whatever was happening with James was visible to others as positive change rather than concerning behavior. Friday afternoon, I left school early to prepare for my evening with James. The ritual of getting ready for a date felt both foreign and familiar, like remembering how to ride a bicycle after years of walking everywhere. I chose a navy blue dress that was elegant but not overly formal, comfortable shoes that would allow for walking, and jewelry that felt special without being ostentatious. By 6:30, I was as ready as I could reasonably be, sitting in my living room and trying not to obsess over every detail of my appearance or anticipate every possible direction our evening might take. The nervousness was partly excitement and partly terror, the emotional combination of someone taking a risk that could either enrich her life significantly or create complications she wasn't prepared to handle. At exactly 7 o'clock, James rang my doorbell. I opened the door to find him wearing dark slacks and a button-down shirt that suggested he'd put thought into his appearance without trying too hard to impress. He looked handsome and slightly nervous, which was oddly reassuring since I was experiencing my own version of first date anxiety. "You look beautiful," he said simply, offering me a small bouquet of mixed flowers that looked like he'd chosen them carefully rather than grabbing whatever was available at the grocery store. "Thank you. You look very handsome yourself." The exchange felt slightly formal, but necessarily so given that we were transitioning from kitchen table conversations to actual romantic interaction. The drive to the restaurant was comfortable, filled with easy conversation about our respective weeks and observations about Portland's downtown development. James was a careful driver, considerate of pedestrians and patient with traffic in a way that suggested he approached most situations with thoughtfulness rather than urgency. Marcello's turned out to be exactly what James had promised. Intimate without being cramped, elegant without being pretentious, with lighting warm enough to create atmosphere without making it impossible to see your dinner companion clearly. The hostess seated us at a corner table that offered privacy for conversation while still feeling connected to the restaurant's general energy. "This is perfect," I said, looking around at the exposed brick walls and candlelit tables. "How did you find this place?" "My mom recommended it, actually. She and her boyfriend came here for their anniversary last month and said it was the best Italian food they'd had outside of actual Italy." James seemed pleased that I approved of his choice. I wanted somewhere we could talk without shouting over loud music or feeling rushed by servers trying to turn tables quickly. The consideration he'd put into planning our evening was touching. Evidence that he'd thought seriously about what would make me comfortable and what would allow us to continue the conversations we'd been enjoying for weeks. Our server was professional but unobtrusive, taking our drink orders and explaining the evening's specials without hovering or interrupting our conversation. James ordered wine after checking that I was interested in sharing a bottle, another small gesture that demonstrated his attention to my preferences rather than simply assuming what I might want. "I have to admit," James said after we'd placed our dinner orders, "I was nervous about tonight. Not about spending time with you, but about whether the transition from your kitchen table to an actual restaurant would feel natural." "I was nervous, too," I confessed. "It's been a very long time since I've been on a first date, and I wasn't sure I remembered how to navigate the social expectations." "I think we're doing fine so far," James said with a smile that eased the tension I'd been carrying. "The conversation feels the same, just with better food and more formal place settings." The wine arrived and James went through the tasting ritual with the server, accepting the bottle after a quick taste and waiting for our glasses to be filled before raising his in a small toast. "To new beginnings and unexpected connections," he said, meeting my eyes as our glasses touched. "To taking chances and seeing what happens," I replied, feeling the significance of the moment settle around us like a warm blanket. The evening unfolded with the kind of natural flow that made time irrelevant. We talked about everything from our families to our professional aspirations to our opinions about art and music and literature. James was an engaged listener and thoughtful conversationalist, asking questions that demonstrated genuine interest in my responses and sharing stories that revealed his character and values. "Can I ask you something that might be too personal?" James said as we shared a dessert that was too rich for one person but perfect for two. "After everything we've talked about tonight, I think we're past worrying about personal questions," I replied. "What made you decide to say yes when I asked you to dinner? Not what you liked about the idea, but what convinced you to take the risk despite all the potential complications?" The question required serious consideration. What had made me willing to step outside my carefully constructed post-divorce boundaries and explore romantic possibilities with someone so much younger? "I think it was realizing that I'd rather risk being hurt again than guarantee staying lonely," I said slowly. "You make me feel interesting and attractive and worth spending time with. Those aren't feelings I was ready to give up just because the situation doesn't fit conventional expectations." "I'm glad you took the risk," James said quietly. "I've been thinking about you since our first conversation, wondering if you might be interested in me the way I was interested in you." "You've been thinking about me?" The idea that our Saturday conversations had stayed with him during the week felt simultaneously flattering and overwhelming. "Every day," James admitted. "Wondering what you were doing in your classes, whether you were grading papers or reading or trying new recipes. Hoping that our next conversation would last even longer than the previous one." His honesty was both thrilling and slightly terrifying in its intensity. James wasn't treating our connection as casual or experimental, but as something he'd been actively hoping would develop into exactly what was happening between us. By the time we finished dinner, the restaurant had emptied around us, and I realized we'd been talking for nearly 3 hours without either of us checking the time or seeming restless to leave. The conversation had been so engaging that the usual first date awkwardness had never materialized. "I should probably get you home," James said reluctantly as our server brought the check. "I don't want you to think I'm the kind of person who keeps you out past a reasonable hour on a first date." "What's a reasonable hour?" I asked, genuinely curious about his expectations. "I have no idea," James admitted with a laugh. "I've never dated anyone who had to work the next day, and I've definitely never taken someone to dinner who has more life experience than I do." The acknowledgement of our age difference was delivered with humor rather than anxiety, suggesting James was comfortable with the unconventional aspects of our situation. The drive back to my house was filled with comfortable conversation about the evening, both of us expressing appreciation for the other's company and agreement that dinner had exceeded our expectations. When James walked me to my front door, the moment felt weighted with the potential for our first kiss, but also uncertain about whether that level of physical intimacy was appropriate for a first date. "I had a wonderful time tonight," I said, turning to face him on my front porch. "Thank you for planning such a perfect evening." "Thank you for saying yes," James replied, stepping slightly closer but not presuming anything about physical contact. "I'd like to see you again if you're interested." "I'm very interested," I said, feeling bold enough to close some of the distance between us. James reached up to brush a strand of hair away from my face, his touch gentle but confident. "May I kiss you goodnight?" The question was perfectly respectful while also making his intentions clear. I nodded, suddenly nervous, but also eager to discover what physical chemistry might exist beyond our intellectual and emotional connection. The kiss was soft and brief, more of a promise than a declaration, but it sent warmth through my entire body in a way that confirmed the romantic potential I'd been hoping for. James's lips were warm, and his touch was gentle, and the moment felt like the natural progression of everything that had been building between us for weeks. "Good night, Kat," he said quietly, his voice slightly deeper than usual. "Good night, James," I replied, already anticipating our next encounter. After he left, I stood in my entryway for several minutes, processing the evening and the kiss and the reality that I'd successfully navigated my first date in over 3 decades. The experience had been everything I'd hoped for, and nothing like I'd feared, a reminder that taking emotional risks could lead to positive outcomes rather than inevitable disappointment. As I prepared for bed, I found myself smiling at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed more alive than she had in months, energized by the possibility of romance and genuine connection with someone who saw her as worth pursuing. The age difference that had seemed so daunting in theory felt much less significant after an evening of natural conversation and obvious compatibility. James had kissed me goodnight on my front porch, and I was already looking forward to discovering what might develop between us next. For the first time since my divorce, I felt optimistic about the future rather than simply resigned to getting through each day. The shift felt significant enough to change everything about how I approached my life, and all because my grocery delivery driver had turned out to be someone worth taking a chance on. Mathematical equations might have predictable solutions, but human connections, I was learning, could surprise you in the most wonderful ways. The proof of our compatibility was still unfolding, but the initial calculations looked remarkably promising. The weeks following our first date settled into a rhythm that felt both exhilarating and natural. James continued his grocery deliveries every Saturday, but now they served as midweek check-ins between our increasingly frequent evening dates. We discovered a shared love of used bookstores and weekend hiking trails, quiet coffee shops where we could talk for hours without interruption, and cooking experiments that sometimes succeeded brilliantly and sometimes resulted in ordering pizza while laughing over our culinary disasters. My sister Emma visited 3 weeks later, ostensibly to see how I was adjusting to single life, but obviously curious about the mysterious James I'd mentioned during our phone conversations. I'd been strategically vague about his age and how we'd met, sharing only that he was kind, intelligent, and made me feel genuinely happy for the first time in years. "So when do I get to meet this wonderful man who's put such a spring in your step?" Emma asked Saturday morning over coffee, noting the fresh flowers on my kitchen table and the generally more vibrant atmosphere of my house. "Actually, he's delivering groceries this afternoon," I said, trying to sound casual. "You'll probably get to meet him briefly if you're still here around 2:30. Emma raised an eyebrow at the coincidence, but didn't press for details. She'd been so relieved to see me emerging from my post-divorce depression that she seemed reluctant to analyze the specifics of my improved mood too closely. When James arrived that afternoon, I introduced him simply as my friend James, without elaborating on the nature of our relationship. Emma was gracious and welcoming, engaging him in conversation about his teaching aspirations, while I pretended not to notice her subtle assessment of his character and intentions. "He seems lovely," Emma said after James left, her tone carefully neutral. Very mature and thoughtful for someone so young. The comment hung in the air, loaded with implications about what she'd observed, but wasn't quite ready to say directly. He is young, I agreed. But age isn't the most important factor in compatibility, is it? No, it's not, Emma said slowly. But large age gaps can create complications that require careful navigation. I just want to make sure you're thinking clearly about the potential challenges. The conversation was gentler than I'd expected, with Emma expressing concern rather than disapproval. She could see that James made me happy, which seemed to outweigh her reservations about the unconventional nature of our relationship. That evening, after Emma had returned to Seattle, James and I had our most honest conversation yet about the external reactions we'd been anticipating. We were walking through Laurelhurst Park, taking advantage of an unusually warm October evening that felt like summer's farewell gift. Your sister seemed nice, but I got the impression she has some concerns about us, James observed, his hand warm in mine as we strolled past families having picnic dinners and couples reading together on park benches. She's protective, which I appreciate even when it's slightly annoying, I replied. Emma wants to make sure I don't get hurt again, which means she views any new relationship with some skepticism. That's understandable. If someone had hurt my sister the way your ex-husband hurt you, I'd probably be suspicious of any new man in her life too. James squeezed my hand gently. What did you tell her about us? Very little, honestly. I mentioned that you were kind and intelligent and made me happy, but I didn't go into specifics about our age difference or how we met. I looked at him directly, needing to gauge his reaction to my cautious approach. I wasn't hiding you. Exactly. But I wasn't ready for the conversation that would follow if she knew all the details. I understand completely. My mom knows I'm seeing someone special, but I haven't mentioned that you're 27 years older than me or that we met through my delivery job. James smiled ruefully. I suppose we're both being somewhat strategic about how much family information to share right now. The acknowledgement that we were both protecting our relationship from external scrutiny felt reassuring rather than concerning. Neither of us was ashamed of our connection, but we were both realistic about the judgments we might face from people who didn't understand what we'd found together. Are you worried about how people will react when we stop being secretive? I asked, genuinely curious about his perspective on the social challenges we might encounter. Sometimes, James admitted, but then I remember how I feel when I'm with you, and other people's opinions seem much less important. We're not hurting anyone. We're both consenting adults, and we make each other genuinely happy. That should be enough. His matter-of-fact approach to potential criticism was both admirable and slightly naive, the response of someone who hadn't yet experienced serious social judgment for his romantic choices. But his confidence was also infectious, making me feel braver about the possibility of living our relationship openly, rather than hiding behind careful omissions and strategic vagueness. November brought the first serious test of our developing relationship when James was offered the temporary teaching position at Westfield Elementary. The opportunity meant better pay, professional development, and the chance to prove himself in a traditional classroom setting. But it also meant a significantly more demanding schedule that would leave less time for leisurely Saturday afternoon conversations and spontaneous evening dates. I want to take the position, James said over dinner at my house, but I'm worried about how it might affect us. The hours are longer, there will be evening events and weekend obligations, and I'll probably be exhausted most of the time while I adjust to full-time teaching. You absolutely should take the position, I said without hesitation. This is exactly the kind of opportunity you've been working toward, and I'd never want to be the reason you turn down a chance to advance your career. But what if we lose what we have? What if we don't see each other as much and drift apart? The vulnerability in James's voice was touching, evidence of how much our relationship had come to mean to him. Then we'll figure out how to maintain our connection within your new schedule, I replied. James, I care about you too much to want anything that isn't genuinely good for your life. If this job makes you happy and helps you build the career you want, then it makes me happy too. The conversation marked a turning point in our relationship, the moment when we both acknowledged that what we had together was worth adapting to life changes rather than simply enjoying while circumstances remained convenient. James started, his teaching position the Monday after Thanksgiving, and I watched him transform from a confident but somewhat directionless young man into someone with genuine professional purpose. He called me most evenings to share stories about his students, discuss lesson planning challenges, and process the steep learning curve of managing 28 third graders while implementing district curriculum requirements. I never realized how much energy it takes to be on for 6 hours straight, he said one Thursday evening, his voice tired but satisfied. I come home completely drained, but also more fulfilled than I've ever felt in any job. That's the teaching paradox, I replied, settling into my favorite chair with a cup of tea and the phone pressed to my ear. The work is exhausting and demanding and sometimes frustrating, but when it's going well, there's nothing more satisfying. Our phone conversations became the foundation of our relationship during those first weeks of his teaching career. We talked every evening, sharing our daily experiences and maintaining the emotional intimacy that had developed during our months of Saturday afternoon talks. The physical separation was challenging, but it also deepened our appreciation for the time we could spend together. December brought the first real crisis when James's mother, Linda, decided to visit Portland for a long weekend and wanted to meet the woman her son had been talking about with such obvious affection. James had finally told her about me, including our age difference and the unconventional way we'd met, and she was curious enough to request an introduction. "She wants to take us both to dinner Saturday night," James said nervously. "She's trying to be supportive, but I can tell she has concerns about the age thing and wants to see for herself what kind of person you are." The prospect of meeting James's mother felt simultaneously like a natural relationship milestone and a potentially awkward encounter that could complicate everything we'd built together. Linda was a pediatric nurse who'd raised 2 children alone after her husband's abandonment, which meant she was probably protective of her son and skeptical of older women who might be taking advantage of his youth and inexperience. "What did you tell her about me?" I asked, needing to understand what expectations she might have formed. "That you're a mathematics teacher, that you're recently divorced, that you're intelligent and kind and make me happier than I've been in years." James paused. "And that you're 55 years old," which definitely surprised her. I imagine it did. What was her reaction? She asked a lot of questions about your intentions and whether I was sure I knew what I was getting into with someone at such a different life stage. James's voice carried a slight edge of frustration. "She's worried that you might be using me as a rebound relationship or that I'm too inexperienced to recognize if I'm being manipulated." The concerns were understandable from a mother's perspective, even if they stung slightly. Linda didn't know me well enough to assess my character, so she was probably focusing on the factors that might suggest problematic power dynamics or emotional exploitation. "Those are reasonable concerns," I said, trying to be fair despite my personal feelings. "She loves you and wants to protect you from getting hurt. I'd probably have similar worries if I were in her position." Saturday evening arrived with December, drizzle and my highest level of first impression anxiety since my job interview at Roosevelt High nearly 3 decades earlier. I chose my outfit carefully, wanting to appear professional and age-appropriate, while still looking attractive enough to explain why James might be interested in me romantically. Linda turned out to be a petite woman in her early 50s, with graying auburn hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she didn't waste time on small talk or social pleasantries. She was polite but reserved during our initial introductions, clearly taking my measure while maintaining the courtesy required for a pleasant evening. Dinner conversation started cautiously, with Linda asking about my teaching career and my family background, while I inquired about her work at the hospital and her experiences raising children as a single mother. James seemed nervous but hopeful, obviously wanting his mother's approval while also prepared to defend our relationship if necessary. The turning point came when Linda mentioned her concerns about the challenges facing public education, and I found myself passionately describing my experiences with budget cuts, standardized testing pressures, and the ongoing struggle to provide meaningful learning opportunities despite administrative constraints. My genuine investment in student success and educational equity seemed to resonate with Linda's own professional dedication to helping children. "It sounds like you really care about your students," Linda observed, her tone warming slightly. "Teaching isn't an easy profession, especially at the high school level." "It's the most rewarding work I've ever done," I replied honestly. There's nothing like watching a student suddenly understand a concept they've been struggling with, or seeing a shy teenager gain confidence through academic success. From there, our conversation flowed more naturally, with Linda sharing stories about the rewards and challenges of pediatric nursing, while I described some of my most memorable students and teaching moments. James relaxed visibly, as his mother, and I discovered common ground in our shared commitment to helping young people succeed. By the end of the evening, Linda's assessment of me seemed to have shifted from skeptical wariness to cautious approval. She hugged me goodbye and told James she'd like to see both of us again during her next visit to Portland. "That went much better than I expected," James said as we drove back to my house. "I could see the exact moment when Mom decided you were genuinely good for me rather than someone she needed to worry about." "When was that?" I asked, curious about his perspective on the evening's dynamics. "When you talked about your students. She could tell that teaching isn't just a job for you, it's a calling." That kind of passion and dedication translated to character credibility in her assessment. James reached over to take my hand. "Plus, I think she realized that someone who's devoted their life to helping teenagers probably isn't going to manipulate or hurt her adult son." The insight was perceptive, and it highlighted something important about how our age difference might actually work in our favor. My decades of experience working with young people, my established career, and my demonstrated commitment to education suggested stability and genuine care rather than predatory intentions. Winter deepened into the kind of steady rain that made Portland famous, and our relationship settled into routines that accommodated James's teaching schedule while maintaining the emotional connection that had brought us together. He spent most weekend evenings at my house, grading papers at my dining room table while I worked on my own lesson plans nearby. We cooked dinner together, watched movies, and talked about our respective weeks with the comfortable intimacy of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. The domestic routine felt natural rather than forced, as if we'd been sharing space for years instead of months. James kept a few changes of clothes in my spare bedroom, and I found myself buying groceries with his preferences in mind alongside my own. The gradual integration of our daily lives happened so smoothly that I barely noticed until I realized how empty my house felt during the rare evenings when he had other obligations. February brought Valentine's Day, and the question of how to acknowledge a romantic holiday when our relationship still felt somewhat secret from the broader world. James solved the dilemma by planning an intimate dinner at my house, complete with flowers, wine, and a carefully prepared meal that showcased the cooking skills he'd been developing under my informal tutelage. "I wanted our first Valentine's Day to be private," he explained as he presented me with a small wrapped box. "Something just for us, without worrying about other people's reactions or judgments." Inside the box was a delicate silver necklace with a small pendant shaped like an infinity symbol. Elegant and understated, but clearly chosen with care and thought. "It's beautiful," I said, genuinely touched by his attention to selecting something. That reflected my personal style, rather than making a grand romantic gesture that might feel performative. "I wanted to get you something that you could wear every day. Something that would remind you of us even when we're apart," James said, fastening the necklace around my neck with gentle fingers that made me shiver slightly. The infinity symbol seemed appropriate for someone who teaches mathematics and believes in logical progressions and eternal truths. The thoughtfulness behind his choice moved me more than expensive jewelry or elaborate surprises would have. James had selected a gift that reflected his understanding of who I was and what would have personal meaning for me, evidence of the attention he'd been paying to my preferences and personality during our months together. Our Valentine's dinner was perfect in its simplicity, with conversation flowing as easily as it had during our first coffee together in my kitchen. We talked about our students, our families, our dreams for the future, and the small daily observations that had become the foundation of our emotional intimacy. "Can I tell you something that might sound presumptuous?" James asked as we shared dessert and watched rain streak the windows. "Of course. I love you, Kat. Not the idea of being with an older woman, not the novelty of our unconventional situation, but you specifically. Your intelligence, your kindness, your laugh, the way you listen when I talk about my students, the way you make me feel like the best version of myself." James's voice was steady but vulnerable. "I know it's complicated and I know we're taking risks, but I wanted you to know how I feel." The declaration hung in the air between us, loaded with significance and requiring a response that would either deepen our commitment or acknowledge that we wanted different things from our relationship. "I love you too," I said quietly, the words feeling both terrifying and absolutely true. "I love your passion for teaching, your respect for other people, your optimism about life even when things are difficult. I love the way you make me feel interesting and attractive and worth caring about." The mutual confession marked another milestone in our relationship, the point where we moved from exploring possibilities to acknowledging genuine commitment, despite all the potential complications surrounding our age difference and unconventional beginning. Spring arrived early that year, with March bringing unusually warm temperatures and the kind of sunshine that made everyone in Portland emerge from their winter hibernation with renewed energy and optimism. James and I began taking evening walks through various neighborhoods, enjoying the luxury of daylight that extended past dinner time and the sight of cherry trees blooming throughout the city. During one of these walks, we encountered Maria Santos from my school walking her dog through Laurelhurst Park. The meeting was inevitable eventually, given that Portland's social circles were smaller than they appeared, but I still felt a moment of panic when I saw her approaching with obvious curiosity about my companion. "Kat, how nice to see you." Maria's greeting was warm, but her eyes were clearly taking in every detail of James's appearance and our body language. "And who is this handsome young man?" "Maria, I'd like you to meet James. James, this is my colleague Maria Santos. She teaches Spanish at Roosevelt." I kept my introduction simple, not specifying the nature of our relationship, but not hiding the fact that we were together. "Nice to meet you, Ms. Santos," James said with his usual polite confidence. "Kat's told me a lot about her wonderful colleagues and how much she enjoys working at Roosevelt. Please call me Maria. Any friend of Kat's is a friend of mine." Maria's smile was genuine, but I could see her mental calculations about James's age and our obvious comfort with each other. "Are you also in education?" "I teach 3rd grade at Westfield Elementary," James replied. "This is my first year in a full-time position, and Kat's been incredibly helpful in sharing her experience and insights about classroom management and curriculum development." The professional connection seemed to reassure Maria slightly, providing a logical context for our friendship that didn't immediately require romantic explanations. After we parted ways, I knew the encounter would generate questions and possibly gossip among my colleagues, but I also felt relieved that our relationship was gradually becoming less secret and more simply private. "That seemed to go well," James observed as we continued our walk. "She seemed nice, and not particularly shocked by seeing us together." "Maria is diplomatic and kind, so she wouldn't express shock even if she felt it," I replied. "But yes, it went better than it could have. Eventually we're going to run into people we know, so it's good to get practice with casual introductions." The acknowledgement that we were moving toward greater openness about our relationship felt both scary and liberating. I was tired of being vague about my social life and strategically omitting details about how I spent my evenings and weekends. April brought James's formal evaluation from his principal and the news that his temporary position would be extended through the following school year, with the possibility of becoming permanent based on his performance and student outcomes. The professional success was exactly what he'd been hoping for. Validation that his career choice was both personally fulfilling and professionally viable. "I couldn't have done this without your support and encouragement," James said, as we celebrated his good news over dinner at the Italian restaurant where we'd had our first date. "Having someone who understood the challenges and could offer practical advice made all the difference. You did this through your own hard work and natural teaching ability," I corrected. "I just listened and offered perspective when you needed it. You offered much more than that. You believed in me when I wasn't sure I could handle a full classroom, and you helped me think through problems instead of just telling me what to do." James reached across the table to take my hand. "You've been the best partner I could have asked for during this transition." The word partner felt significant, a step beyond girlfriend or person I'm dating, towards something that acknowledged the depth of our commitment and mutual support. May marked our 1-year anniversary of knowing each other, though we calculated the date from our first conversation rather than our first official date. The milestone felt worth acknowledging, given how much had changed in both our lives since that first Saturday afternoon when James had delivered groceries and stayed for unexpected conversation. A year ago, did you think we'd end up here? James asked as we sat on my back deck, enjoying an unusually warm evening and a bottle of wine from the first delivery he'd made to my house. A year ago, I wasn't thinking about romantic possibilities at all, I admitted. I was focused on getting through each day without falling apart, figuring out who I was as a single person after 32 years of marriage. And now I can't imagine my life without you in it, I said honestly. You've helped me remember that I'm someone worth loving, someone interesting enough to build a future with. You've done the same for me, James replied. Before I met you, I felt like I was drifting, working temporary jobs and hoping something would eventually click into place. Now I have a career I love, and a relationship that makes everything else in my life feel more meaningful. The conversation continued into the evening, with both of us reflecting on how our individual lives had improved through our connection and our shared experiences. The age difference that had once seemed like an insurmountable obstacle now felt like simply one characteristic of our relationship among many others. As summer approached, we began discussing plans for James to officially move in with me, rather than continuing the informal arrangement of spending most nights at my house while maintaining his own apartment. The decision felt natural, rather than rushed, the logical next step for two people who'd discovered they preferred sharing daily life to living separately. Are you sure you're ready for that level of commitment? I asked, wanting to make certain he'd thought through the implications of cohabitation, rather than simply drifting into greater domestic integration. I've been ready for months, James replied. I just wanted to make sure you were comfortable with the idea and not feeling pressured by practical convenience. The consideration was typical of James's approach to our relationship, always checking to ensure my comfort and consent, rather than assuming his desires aligned with mine. By June, we'd successfully merged our households, with James's books integrated into my shelves, his clothes hanging in my closet, and his lesson plans spread across my dining room table, alongside my own summer curriculum development. The domestic harmony was remarkable. Two people with compatible living styles and shared values creating a home that felt comfortable and welcoming for both of us. The merger also meant we could no longer avoid questions from friends, colleagues, and family members who noticed the obvious signs of cohabitation. Emma visited in July and immediately observed the evidence of a male presence in my house, from the larger shoes by the front door to the distinctly masculine toiletries in my bathroom. So James has moved in, she said over morning coffee, her tone carefully neutral. Yes, it seemed silly for him to keep paying rent on an apartment he wasn't using, I replied, matching her matter-of-fact delivery. And how are you feeling about that? About living with someone again after being on your own for over a year? The question was genuine rather than judgmental. Emma's professional training helping her focus on my emotional welfare, rather than the unconventional aspects of my relationship. I feel happy, I said simply. Happier than I've been in years, maybe decades. James and I work well together as partners, both practically and emotionally. That's what matters most, Emma said, and I could hear her letting go of whatever concerns she'd been carrying about my choices. You seem genuinely content in a way that I wasn't sure you'd ever achieve again after the divorce. The conversation marked another level of family acceptance. Emma's acknowledgement that my relationship with James was contributing positively to my overall well-being rather than creating problems she needed to worry about. September brought the start of a new school year for both of us, with James returning to Westfield as a permanent third-grade teacher and me beginning my 29th year at Roosevelt High. The parallel rhythms of our professional lives created a shared understanding of teaching challenges and seasonal cycles that strengthened our personal bond. We hosted our first dinner party in October, inviting James's mother Linda and her boyfriend, along with Maria Santos and her husband, for an evening that felt like a successful integration of our respective social circles. The conversation flowed easily, with Linda and Maria discovering common ground in their experiences working with children, while their partners bonded over sports and local politics. I think we passed some kind of test tonight, James observed as we cleaned up after our guests had left. Everyone seemed to genuinely enjoy themselves, and no one acted like our relationship was strange or concerning. Your mother likes me much better now that she's seen how we interact in our normal environment, I agreed. And Maria has been curious about you for months, so getting to meet you properly probably answered a lot of questions she was too polite to ask directly. The successful dinner party felt like another milestone in our journey toward fully integrated lives, rather than carefully compartmentalized relationship management. Winter brought challenges in the form of James's family drama when his younger sister Katie announced her engagement to someone their mother disapproved of, creating tension that required James to navigate between loyalty to his sister and respect for his mother's concerns. I found myself in the unexpected position of offering perspective based on my experience with family dynamics and relationship conflicts. Sometimes the best thing you can do is support the people you love while staying out of their decision-making. Process, I suggested after James had spent an entire evening processing phone calls from both his mother and his sister. Katie needs to know you'll be there for her regardless of how her relationship works out. And Linda needs to know you hear her concerns, even if you can't fix the situation. The advice seemed to help James find a balanced approach that maintained his relationships with both family members while avoiding taking sides in their conflict. The situation also demonstrated how our different life experiences could complement each other, my decades of observing family dynamics providing useful perspective for his current challenges. Spring returned with the kind of dramatic beauty that made Portland residents forget about months of gray drizzle, and James and I began discussing long-term plans that extended beyond our current comfortable routine. We talked about travel destinations, potential home improvements, and the possibility of James pursuing a master's degree in education while continuing his teaching career. Do you ever think about what people will say when we've been together for 5 years, 10 years? James asked during one of our evening walks through the neighborhood. When the novelty of our age difference wears off and we're just an established couple with a significant gap in our birth years. I think most people will stop noticing or caring, I replied. Age differences become less remarkable when relationships prove their stability over time. I hope you're right. I want to be able to attend your school functions and meet your students' parents without having to explain why I look so much younger than you. The comment touched on something we hadn't discussed extensively, but both occasionally worried about: the long-term social implications of our age difference as we move through different life stages together. James, are you concerned about being with someone who's going to age faster than you? About what our relationship will look like when I'm 65 and you're 38? The question felt necessary, but also terrifying to ask directly. I'm concerned about losing you to anything, whether that's aging or illness or accident or simply growing apart, James replied seriously. But I'm not concerned about your age specifically. People who love each other figure out how to navigate life changes together, regardless of their starting points. The maturity of his response reassured me, while also highlighting how thoughtfully he'd considered the practical aspects of our relationship timeline. By our second anniversary, James and I had settled into the kind of comfortable partnership that felt both passionate and sustainable. We maintained our individual interests and friendships while building shared traditions and mutual goals. My colleagues at Roosevelt had grown accustomed to seeing James at school functions, and his co-workers at Westfield knew me as his live-in partner, rather than some mysterious older woman he occasionally mentioned. The relationship that had begun with a simple grocery delivery had evolved into something that neither of us could have anticipated, but both of us treasured. James had helped me rediscover my capacity for joy and romance after a difficult divorce, while I had provided him with emotional support and practical guidance during his transition into his chosen career. "Do you ever regret taking the risk?" James asked one Saturday morning as we shared coffee and the newspaper at my kitchen table, exactly where our first extended conversation had taken place nearly 2 years earlier. "Never," I said without hesitation. Even if things hadn't worked out between us, I would never regret discovering that I could still feel this way about someone, that I could still be interesting and attractive to someone worth caring about. "I love you, Cat Mills," James said, reaching across the table to touch the infinity necklace he'd given me the previous Valentine's Day, and that I'd worn every day since. "I love you too, James," I replied, meaning it more completely than I'd ever meant anything in my life. The story that had started with an unexpected request to carry groceries and a heart had become something neither of us had planned, but both of us had chosen to nurture into lasting love. Sometimes the most important connections begin with the simplest interactions, and sometimes taking a chance on someone completely different from what you expected can lead to exactly what you didn't know you needed. Mathematical equations might have predictable solutions, but human hearts, I'd learned, operated by much more complex and beautiful formulas. The proof of our love continued to unfold each day, written in shared laughter, quiet conversations, and the simple miracle of two people who'd found each other when neither was looking for love. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.